side of things. Appreciate that. And welcome to everyone that's online, and welcome to everyone in the room. I'm Kato Samuel, and I'm the chair of the APPG for No Recourse to Public Funds. This event is in conjunction with, jointly with, the APPG for Households in Temporary Accommodation. And this session is going to really be hearing from experts and those who are actually going through and have got lived experience of having to navigate life with no recourse to public funds attached to them. And this briefing that we're going to have, I really hope it's going to be interactive. I hope those of you online will think of questions that you can pose at the very end. So we are going to start our first speaker, which I hope Alex is there. Yes. Our first speaker is Alex Proctor. And Alex Proctor is the Research and Policy Coordinator at Just Life Foundation. So I'm going to hand over to Alex. Alex has 7 minutes, and if you could kindly introduce yourself, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much, Alex. Good to see you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for suggesting this really important joint event between our two PPGs. It's really important, and I'm sure we'll see many reasons why throughout this session, and I'm hoping to cover a little bit of that in my talk. So yeah, I am the Research and Policy Coordinator for Just Life. We work with single households who live in temporary accommodation. We work frontline in Brighton and in Manchester, but we also have a national systems change and research and policy team, which I'm part of. And as part of that, we co-secretariat with Shared Health, the APPG for households in temporary accommodation. So I'm going to start off by saying that I actually know very little about this this area. And I think that you might be wondering, why am I here then? But I actually think that coming into this space and saying that it feels to me quite important, because I feel like I should know more than I do. And I feel that I speak for myself, and I know that I speak for some of my colleagues within my organisation and within the sector for saying that we feel like we should have more knowledge around this, because the two areas, the area of TA, the area of working with people who are in temporary accommodation, who have permanent residency, for example, in the UK, and the area of people who have no recourse to public funds and maybe are experiencing Section 17, are actually not so far apart as maybe they look on paper based on the way that the work is divided governmentally. So what do I mean by that? So I'm going to talk a little bit about my organisation and what we see. So we work, as I said, supporting people in TA, in temporary accommodation, when people have been found owed a main duty, but also in a form of temporary accommodation called UTA, which is unsupported temporary accommodation. And that's things like that might present like bed and breakfasts or hostels, or houses in multiple occupancy that aren't through the traditional routes of being owed a main duty and placed by council, but tend to be the sort of places people end up when they're not owed a main duty, or when, in other words, they can't get support from local authority. So we in Brighton, so we tend to work, we're commissioned in Brighton, and we work with people who are placed by the council in temporary accommodation. So in Brighton, we tend to meet people who may at one point have had an experience under the No Recourse to Public Funds label, who now are have leave to remain and have a changed settled status, who are now in TA. But one thing that we find when we work with people who may have had this experience is that often there is a bit of a legacy of trauma from the system. We often find that people may have had experiences that lead them to be suspicious of systems and therefore less likely to access support. And we often also find that people may have experienced the sort of systemic trauma that we don't really have knowledge about, because it's not within the TA system that we're used to working in, which again, we feel like we should have that knowledge of. So often we end up working with people who need more, I suppose, more complex support from us that it feels like we don't necessarily understand how to give because of the siloed nature of the systems. Now, I say we don't understand it, but we are working to understand that, part of the reason why we're here. So that's one side of it. That's the sort of the commission side of support that we give and people we meet for that. The other side is mainly in Manchester. So this UTA, unsupported temporary accommodation, that I mentioned. So in the line of our work, we'll go to unsupported temporary accommodation spaces. This is not a commission service. This is where we'll go out and we'll meet people, meet them where they're at, talk to them. And often through doing that, our frontline support workers will meet people who maybe have ended up in these places because they've not, they've basically been either under a Section 17 accommodation and then had to move on and sorted their own solution out, as it were, or they don't necessarily know what support they're entitled to and end up in these UTAs. Either way, when we meet people living in these spaces, it's a very similar story, though looks different on the surface. It's similar in the sense that the support needs are always a lot more complex, and we have to really, there's a lot of time that's needed, which we're always very happy to give, but a lot of time and a lot of listening needed to really help people with their needs, and to help people work through the trauma that they've had through going through that system. So those are two real kind of overviews of the work. And I guess what I'm trying to say with this is that although we don't work or haven't traditionally worked directly with people who are experiencing no recourse to public funds, Section 17 housing, what we do meet often is the shape of the gap in our knowledge and also the intersectional nature of people's experiences. And I think really that's what I'm trying to say, that people, we're intersectional beings. We have many experiences, and many people, and I think an increasing number of people in this country who experience homelessness will potentially have had an experience of coming to this country as a refugee, as an asylum seeker, and potentially going through the no recourse to public funds experience. So it feels to me really important that our sectors are joining up and talking to each other and learning from each other. And that's the other thing that I wanted to say really, was that when I was reading through the briefing notes about this event, and about the work that you've been doing around Section 17, what really struck me is the similarities between your work, your thinking, your learning, and what we've been thinking, learning, and hearing through our work with the TA households and temporary accommodation, APPG, and through my organisation's work on the ground. So it really feels like there's a real rich ground for us to share information, really with the collective goal of improving people's experiences, and understanding what kind of systemic change we can jointly be asking for in order to make the system more humane and work better for people. So yeah, that's it really in summary. I think that it's really important that we're coming together and that we're sharing our knowledge. And I really hope that me coming here and saying I'm not an expert, but I'm here to tell you what I've seen and to sort of say really that we want to learn is useful to people. So thank you again for hosting this really important event, and that is all from me.
Thank you so much, Alex, and I really appreciate the way that you're approaching this topic and how open you are to share ideas and how we can work together, because we're much stronger if we're working together, and of course so much overlaps. For those of you online who again may not be very clear with no recourse to public funds, and why this APPG is so important is for us to be able to draw attention to the challenges faced by destitute migrants who have no recourse to public funds. And by virtue, basically, of their irregular immigration status or conditions imposed on their visas, it really impacts on the way that they are living and how their children, in many cases, don't have access to anything that can support them whilst they're at school. So it's really important that we're having this event, but actually you can see just by virtue of their immigration status, there is so many aspects of their life where they will be negatively impacted, whether that's work, whether that's health, whether that's where they're living. So we can work with lots of APPGs and actually learn from many experts who again are seeing this on the front line, but maybe don't understand how can we work again across all these different sections, because the more we can work together, it will only hopefully improve those people's lives and those families' lives. So thank you so much, Alex, and I really look forward to working with you. We all look forward to working with you, and I think the more test cases that we can present, the more work that we can bring to the table, especially in Parliament, we actually can make sure more parliamentarians possibly are getting this in their inbox, don't really understand how to work with it. But if we can assist them in any way, it will only make things better for their constituents. So our second speaker is Angie. Angie, please help me say your surname.
Hello.
I'm Nigerian, so I should know, but I'm struggling. Help me here.
So it's Angela Watara, but Angie is fine.
Angie's fine. So
Yeah,
Angie, thank you. Thank you for understanding.
I went from Sims to Watara, and it was a very big shift.
Big shift.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So I'll just give you a little background about myself. I say the same as Alex, I'm no expert, but I will bring my experience of working as a midwife for 20 years in inner city Salford, and then also for Shared Health Foundation, which is a philanthropic organisation. Sam, I can see, is there with you today, and we are really blessed to be funded by an amazing family that allow us to look at where the gaps are. And like I say, I've been a midwife for 20 years. Historically, I did lead on a refugee and asylum midwifery antenatal clinic, but that was a few years ago, and I know lots has changed. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, I really knew that I wanted to come and work for Shared Health and look at their Homeless Families project. So I lead on that up here in Oldham, and we're into our third year now. So we've been going a little while, and our remit, I guess, is a bit similar to Alex. So we work alongside families that are placed in temporary accommodation, and that's right the way from the beginning when the duty is accepted by Oldham, right the way through, and we keep those families until they've been a year into their tenancy, until it's nice and stable. So again, my experience is really around the temporary accommodation journey for families and all of the health inequalities that we see within that are impacted by that homeless journey. I think Sam will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at Shared Health we would definitely say that the homeless journey is an adverse childhood experience, and when we're looking at those little ones going through this system, education disrupted, health appointments disrupted, that for us is really, really super significant. But myself as well, coming at it as a midwife of 20 years, I am so passionate. I'm sure you've all heard about the 5 times project, and just the fact the health inequalities that impact, and that came so into view when I ran the antenatal clinic for asylum and refugee women, and all of the ways in which their lives were impacted at point of entry into the health system, but also in the temporary accommodation journey. So I think what we've seen over the last 2.5 years now going in is that we've got a whole generation of sons and daughters being born in temporary accommodation, whether they've been conceived, born, and then some of them have started primary school. And I guess this for us is where our attention is really starting to drill down into how these children's lives is being affected, but also women of childbearing age. And when I left midwifery in a hospital sense, who would have ever thought that they're all under that umbrella, under the most vulnerable women and families, under the homeless, system and journey. So I just wanted, if it's okay, to bring 3 case studies that I think sort of fit in really nicely. The first one, the families that we come across where they have got their papers, they have gone through circular accommodation, that's section 17 accommodation, but then as soon as they have their papers, they're placed at the beginning of another homeless journey in temporary accommodation to do that as a family. And I can only speak from our experience with the few families that we've had, but they're quite large families, and what we know is families that have got 4 or more children, the housing and waiting for that housing can be years. So they've already done one system and one unsettled living life, having babies, starting school, and then all of a sudden that house is removed or that accommodation is removed, and they're placed into another system where they go to it feels like to them, the bottom of the pack. And so for one example, this family that I'm just referring to now, their youngest has got sickle cell disease because they were placed in a temporary accommodation that was away from the geographical area for their GP practice. They were removed from that GP practice, so his medication review, his regular prescriptions, all you know, got disrupted because of this change from one system into another. And I think that's really what Alex was saying about these systems that run alongside each other. They impact each other, but actually there's so much more for children and vulnerable women, especially, I think, in this group. And then for them, they went from being in a house into a 2-bed with a very little kitchenette, no cooking facilities, and cooking for that mama was really super important for her children and the health and well-being for them. And so still we see them in this place where they're bidding and they're trying to get that stability, but they're so far away from school that dad is doing sometimes 2 bus journeys, depending on whether he can get those children into school. So education is impacted. So that's one example of the sort of families that we see. The other one, we run in Oldham. We are really blessed that we are piloting what we call the Healthy Gems Hub, which is like a baby bank. So if you don't know what that is, it's a little bit like a food bank, but for babies and families in crisis. We provide baby milk, safety equipment, all of those aspects when families are in crisis, where there's a child, because we believe that first 1,001 days of life is super, super important for those foundation stones for those little ones. So we support that, and that's our basic level sort of social prescribing response to those families. But then what we see after that is sometimes those families where women have come to the UK, they've been on a promise of relationship and a future, they've got pregnant, they then have come on a visitor's visa, they then have delivered their baby, and we've literally had this last month where a lady came with a 4-week-old baby who is now sofa surfing in another house because the family that she thought she was going to have, the partner actually then had another family and said he wasn't going to support this baby. So a very kind lady from a local church said she would help to support. And then she's in a place where she's received a medical bill from the hospital for accessing maternity services. And then where do we look for the future for this little one? As she's on a visitor's visa, so that no recourse, not being able to access anything. And it's really, really super complex for these families in that early stage of the postnatal period, where all of those risks for mum and baby, her mental health, the stability, and making sure that we're accessing immunisation schedules, making sure that that baby's having a 6-week check, making sure the health visitors are on board. So we're doing a lot of that work around making sure that those health aspects for those vulnerable mums is not missing, but also we're dealing with the devastation that the dream, the hope that they thought they would have, the family they thought they would have, the future to raise that child is in the balance a little bit and is really difficult. So that's another experience for us of what we've seen come through our caseload here in Oldham. And the third one I would say is when there is no recourse, when they don't have their papers, and then there is a point at which services will refer to social services to support that family in a financial way with accommodation until they get their papers. And again, you can say, well, they're in a hotel for, 6-8 months, but living in a hotel with a baby where you then have to move each few days so that can be cleaned and moved around. There's lots of complexity around that for the way that social services link into other services into the GP. So all of those points, I guess, is where we feed in and what we want to learn more about and work with you. And really pleased that we're here to just see if we can find a way. It's so complex. We fill the gaps all the time, but we want to do that better, and we want to do it better for the next generation and those children that are being born into this system that they have no control over. So I'm really thankful. I hope that's okay. That's sort of our experience here in Oldham with the families that we're meeting.
Thank you so much, Angie, for giving us a real understanding of what you're doing. There's so much to unpack there, but just the fact that the journey for so many families, it doesn't seem to come to an end. And as you rightly said, there's one list that they're on in the temporary space, and once their mum's papers get sorted, then they go back into another system trying to, get housing, and that impact that it has on children. We all know that if you haven't got a comfortable home that's warm and secure, it does impact on you in many ways. You didn't touch on mental health, but I can just well imagine
And what I would say is, as at an absolute minimum, the impact on health and education. So maybe missed immunisations, maybe not getting a place in school. That's an absolute minimum. Our extremes that we know are out there are families that haven't been able, because of the hardship and the financial hardship, haven't been able to purchase safety equipment. So they've not been able to practice safer sleep guidance. They've not been able to buy baby gates. We know that there are cot deaths and there are maternal deaths that are linked to the population that we're discussing and the families that we're talking about. And that is a reality that as we get further into this crisis, as we get further into the cost of living and the impact on the housing system, I think many of us are worried about that for our most vulnerable families and our children that don't have a voice in this system.
Yes, so you're really touching on a lot of very important points there, especially when you think of those families who are helping them. How is the cost of living crisis going to affect those families who are assisting the families who don't have anything? So, there is so much for us to look out for, and we're going to do our utmost to do that. So thank you so much, Angie. I'll pass over to
Hi, thank you, Kate. So I think we're going to be hearing now from two of our lived experience members who are going to contribute by telling us what it's like and the difficulties that they face in the accommodation that's provided under Section 17 support. So I think we should have Francisca.
Yeah, hello.
Hi, Francisca.
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Francisca. Thank you for having me here. I am a single mother. I have 2 children. Before I was given an accommodation, I kept going to the council for 2 years. And anytime I go, I was being turned back. They kept saying to me to remain with my ex-partner because with him, I would have a place to stay. He is eligible for housing and everything, so they would support me if only I am with him. They said that was the only way. But I had to think about the safety of my children. So then I didn't go back to him. Still, they didn't help me. So lucky for me, I found Project 17, who helped me get my accommodation where I was originally with my 2 children. Before I recently moved to this new place, I stayed in that accommodation for 2 years. It was a 1-bed flat. At the time, my children were 3 years and 5 years. Both were still in the buggy, which made things even more difficult as I had to operate prior to this. Due to this, I had a really bad back pain because the accommodation that I was given, I was on the 2nd floor, but there was no lift in that accommodation. So I had to, when I go out to buy things, I need to carry either my 2 children upstairs with some bags or leave the children downstairs, take some bag upstairs and come back. That was quite difficult for me. Thank you.
Great, Francisca, can you also talk a little bit more about the problems that your children faced in the accommodation?
It was hard because the space in there was quite small, and to have children indoors for sometimes the whole day and then they can't go downstairs to play, that was difficult. I even built up shelves very high shelves to put their children's toys, and that was also dangerous because then if any toy drops on them where they play, that's going to be very dangerous. But then we had no choice because the space was very limited. There was damp in the house because the bathroom was leaking. They didn't want to fix it, and that wasn't healthy for the children. And also mostly we were stuck upstairs because to go downstairs there was nothing to do, and having to carry Whitney, that's my last born, the 3-year-old, with a pushchair, come downstairs, carry it back again, and then go upstairs was quite difficult. So mostly they were indoors. So having outdoor playing wasn't much of a choice for us. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and you said that there was problems with the property. What kind of problems did you have for the property?
So
Accommodation.
yeah, the boiler we didn't have a boiler. We had like a tank, you know, the big tank for the hot water. It got spoiled. It heats up and then it doesn't have the thermostat got spoiled, so it just boils up non-stop. The water boils to like a boiling point. When the children sometimes go to the bathroom and they need to wash their hand and you don't rush there, they can easily get burned because the water was really boiling. They didn't want to fix it for months. They just left it. The bathroom floor was leaking. The bath was leaking. They didn't want to fix it. It kept leaking to the property underneath me. The person's ceiling so much that once the floor caved in, it leaked so much. The floor was so weak that it caved in. There was literally a hole in the floor so much that my neighbor downstairs had to call the fire brigade to come in. When they had come, they had called the landlord before he came to attend to it. When I was telling him, he didn't listen. There was damp, there was fungi, the bathroom literally smells, but they didn't want to fix it. There was a whole leak happening, and that was very dangerous. The floor was weak, but they didn't want to fix it.
Thank you, Francesca. And I just wanted to ask you about health issues for your children. Can you talk a little bit about health issues resulting from the accommodation that you were placed in?
Yes, I would say with regards to the health issues, mostly because of the dam. My daughter in particular, that's one thing I wanted to add to. When we used to live there, she was constantly having flu. She was constantly not feeling well. And note that my two children, they were both born premature. And then we had to live in that space, and they knew that it wasn't safe for us with the dump and all that was happening. But then they made us live there. So health-wise, I say mentally, they were really stressed. And then, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Francisca, for sharing the stories, the accommodation and your experiences in it. I want to just move on to Joy. I think, Joy, you should be there as well. Hello, Joy.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joy. I'm a mother with 3 children. When we got to the section 17, my daughter, she was age of 10, and the second one, age of 6, the last one, age of 2. So I was living with my ex-husband then, but I can't be able to stay with him any longer because of what is going on there with my children. So we went to the project the section 17. So when we got there, then I spoke to them. They told me that I have to go back to the place, that's where they will help us out. So, but I refused. I have to call MP. So MP said I should not worry. So MP contacted Project 17. So later, the Project 17, because we are still in the front of the building there, the Project 17 contacted me that MP was informed that we are at council, that this is what is going on. So they said no, they have to go back. So Project 17 now said that there's no problem. If they don't want to accept us now, they said they want to do assessments that they'll give us an accommodation. So Project 17 gave us 3 days accommodation. So when we got there, on that day of the assessment, and when they did the assessment, I was told again that I have to go back there again. And I told them that I can't go back there because of what we have been facing in the house with my ex-husband. So they said, okay, there's no problem, that we should wait. They delay us till 7:30 p.m. But they are still telling us that we have to wait. So they confirmed them that there's no way we can sleep, that they've already up for 3 days, that they have to get an accommodation for us. So they put us in a hotel. I don't know, maybe it's an entire hotel, bread and breakfast. But they didn't give us any breakfast there, anything. They didn't give us anything there. So we were issued voucher, Tesco voucher then. So they gave us one room. We have a double bed and 2 single bed inside the room because there's no space. Everywhere was tight, with other family, with 15 family living in the bread and breakfast. That accommodation that they were giving us there wasn't good at all. because there's a lot of people there, different people there. It was a day that I think a lady and a guy start each other. I was bringing the children from the school. So the children saw it, I have to push them inside. They said, Mommy, what's that? Is that? So I closed them out that there's nothing. We have to lock ourselves inside. It's about 20 minutes. So I have to go, because there's a security. They have to go to the man that was going to. He said, there's a lady in this building that is our husband stabbed her. So I was, and the building, there's a lot of smoke, cigarette, a lot of things in the house. We are there for a month until when the children's social worker came. When she came, and I told her that this is how that they gave us, this is how we are living. This is how we are living. So she said she's going to talk to them. The following day, they spoke to me again that I have to go back to my husband, that they are not giving us accommodation. Unless if you want to stay here, they would tell the owner of that place that we should go out. Until when they move us, they say, okay, if they want to move us because of my husband, because he's a domestic, that they can't put us closer to each other, they have to take us from a borough to another borough. So when we got there, it was really far. From our previous place to where we are now is about 2.5 hours by bus, and we are giving voucher then. So when they move us here, I told them that how are we going to deal with the kids? They said I have to change the children's school. Change children's school, just change it like that. They said we have to change it. I was worried, so I continued because I have a Oyster card I was using before, so I have to. Because when they gave us the voucher, they gave us a transport allowance on my Oyster card. So I have to take the children. I have to wake them early in the morning because I have 10. I have 6. I have 2 years old. Then he was in Buggy then, so I have to wake them early to go all the way from here to 2.5 hours by journey. So I was looking at the stress is too much for the kids. I have to look for a nearby school for them because there's no I can do it. The Oyster card is almost expired, the one they gave us. So there's no how we can do it. They are just telling me I have to change it. I told them that you don't even think about the mental issue of these students because they are going to meet new people or something like that. It's good because my son said he's not changing his school. That I have to continue taking him. I told you there's no how we can do it. There's no how we can do because waking you guys up early, bring you back late, and waking up again is not easy. And it was cold then. It was very cold because it's around December time. It was very cold. So I have to encourage the children that you have to stay. For throughout that time that we changed the school, that I changed the school, about 2 months, about 3 months, my son always cry everything that he don't like the school. Nobody play with him in school. He wants to go back to that school. And he told his teacher that he wants to go back. He told the new teacher that he wants to go back to his old school, that he don't want to stay here. The teacher called me that this is what my son said. So we started encouraging him. So people play with him. They bring him. He even have a counselor that see him every Friday so that he can used to what is going on in this area. So the new house that they gave us now that we have is going to be 2 years now that we're here now. 2 years now. Anytime I complain to them that because they give us 2 rooms in the house, because we are living with about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 families, includes us making 7 families. So we are living we share the same bathroom, the same toilet. So anytime I complain to them that this building is not convenient for the children, especially my daughter, she always complains that she wants to have a room. A lot of things she used to say, but I always encourage her because I don't have choice. Because I don't have way to say, I don't have money to do anything. So I always encourage her. Sometimes she will just close the door that she don't want to see anybody in one of the room. I don't know. So the room that we are staying at, we have 2 rooms now that they gave us in this building. The other, I have to convert 1 room for them to be playing in. The other room, they gave us 1 bunk bed and 1 double bed. That's where we are living. That's where my son used to potty sometimes. If someone is in a toilet, he used to use potty inside. They use potty inside because it's very difficult. If someone is in the toilet, there's no how they can do it. They say they want to wait, they want to put, so I have to use the potty inside the room. And I complained that, I take to the picture, I send it to them in council. They didn't see anything. They just threatening me that if I don't want the accommodation, they will take the children from me. They will take it back to my ex-husband. If my husband didn't take the children, they will take it to the foster house. It's very difficult for us here. The children, they don't have anywhere to play. They just come back from school, sit down in one place. And even they want to stay, we go to the other, because it's very, very small rooms. Very small rooms.
Thank you so much, Joy.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for giving us a snapshot of what you are having to live through day in, day out. Sounds very, very difficult. You know, I send my love to you and family. I'm sorry that this is happening to them and the impact it's having on your children. And please make sure that you use all the services to, help your children whilst they transition into something which I hope will be permanent. Not all this instability. It's so horrible to hear. They're so young, it's hard for you to explain to them as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Francesca, as well.
Welcome. You're welcome.
Appreciate that, and I hope those of you online are able to understand how important the work that we're doing. How it's more than important. It should be an emergency, because what we've just heard, as far as we're concerned, people's human rights have literally been infringed upon. This is wrong. It shouldn't be happening, but it is. So now we're going to move on to Justina. Mara, hopefully you're on the line. Justina? Oh, there we go. Excellent.
I'm sorry about that. I tend to be slow on the mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you. Welcome, Justina.
Hi. Okay. Oh, that was a little bit depressing. And for somebody who is kind of like administering support to people who have got no recourse to public funds, all of that is familiar to me. Okay. My name is Justina Kamara, and I'm the manager of the No Recourse to Public Funds team in Manchester. So I think if you search No Recourse to Public Funds team on the internet in Manchester or Greater Manchester, it's only our team that comes up. So sometimes we get people coming from all the other boroughs to try and ask us for support, but we're able to send the referrals back. What I opted to speak about today was some of the things that you've already discussed, but lack of choice of accommodation for us is the biggest thing. And I could hear from the last speaker. Unfortunately, people look at people who've got the no recourse to public funds condition attached to the status, almost kind of like an underclass. And I'm saying that as somebody who is an immigrant as well, who has experienced the immigration process. And I am really, really passionate about the work that I do in the No Recourse to Public Funds team, and any way that I can help to lessen some of the stresses and burdens that people who come to us and who we do support. I try to do it, but I'm just going to go through some of the issues that we have and they in turn have. It's accessing accommodation. We tend to use bed and breakfast quite a lot. And we tend to do that initially, mainly because we're not able to access standalone accommodation. And reason for this is, even though we've got accommodation providers that we use in the private sector, they don't really like for us to access them for only short term. So most of the time when we try to access private accommodation, they would want us to have extended license. So if we have, say, for example, somebody who is applying for destitute domestic violence concession, that would take a few weeks for the Home Office to deal with that application. So if we ask an accommodation provider to keep them in standalone accommodation, they would not want to do that because they're not benefiting from it in a way, because it would involve them trying to set up their accommodation, and they themselves sometimes procure accommodation from other private landlords. So that becomes a little bit difficult. Some of you have already mentioned a lot of the issues that we have with bed and breakfast. I'm glad to say that all the bed and breakfast that we provide to our citizens do provide breakfast, but we have to accept the fact that a lot of them don't have cooking facilities. In fact, of all the bed and breakfast accommodation that we use, only one of them have got cooking facilities. And again, some of you have already mentioned some of the issues in terms of the distance away from school, distance away from the GP, and a lot of other associated difficulties that we may have with that. When we do grant people subsistence allowance, we take things like that into account. Although there is a kind of like a nominal amount of money that would give in terms of subsistence benefit, which I think is at par with what Section 4 is. That is £40.85 per person. But if it is necessary for us to increase that, we will take that into account. There is also difficulty sometimes in the hotel. Other people complaining when families are living in the hotels, complaining of noise. And as the previous speaker has just mentioned as well, sometimes it's going to be difficult for them to have somewhere to play. So they would come home straight from work and they probably have to stay in the hotel room. We're all aware of those difficulties, and I think I'll talk later on about ways in which the local authority is looking to try and improve things. So private sectors, our biggest provider, and what we do is we take a license from them. What we tend to do is keep people in in bed and breakfast for as short as possible, and then try and get accommodation providers to take them in. Obviously, the ones who we know just from experience are going to be taking a long while for the immigration status to be sorted out. We would try and put them in these accommodation. And for others like the DDVC that I've spoken about, we will leave them in bed and breakfast. And where possible, we will try and keep them in one of the bed and breakfasts that we use that have got cooking facilities. The issues that have been mentioned by the citizens about private rented accommodation is some of the issues that we have ourselves. We obviously have to inspect the properties before we put citizens in the properties. And when we do, they tend to be fine, but sometime down the line, citizens experience damp and mold and all of the issues that people have spoken about. And when we do get the private providers to fix these issues, some of them do, some of them kind of like paper over it. And somewhere down the line, some of these issues may occur again. And then it becomes a question of, do we move them again to hotels, or do we try and continue to ask the private accommodation provider to fix these? And the other thing as well, most of these accommodation that we get from the private sectors tend to be in deprived areas. I remember when I did my placement in this team that I'm working in now, we used to have accommodation to access, say, in southern Manchester and places like Chorlton and Didsbury. Those are all gone, they're non-existent. They tend to be more in the northern area of Manchester, where if a kid is already in school, say in the southern part of Manchester, obviously they're going to have difficulty like the previous speaker has already spoken about. It might take 2 buses, sometimes maybe even 3 buses to take their children to school. Manchester City Council has got something in place where I think if a child lives so many miles away from their school, they can apply for a free bus pass. But we find that to be difficult as well sometimes. It's a hit and miss. Some families are able to get them and other families are not able to get them. There are two other accommodations that we tend to use, and those are what we would like really, because they're the better ones. And these are refugees and housing association accommodation. With refugees, we tend to put people there who are fleeing domestic violence. But unfortunately, they tend to be the ones who we know that are going to have an outcome, i.e. if they marry to somebody who is a British national, or if they marry to somebody who's got indefinite leave to remain in the UK. The advantages with putting families in these accommodations is because they're going to get a lot of support from people in the refuge, and other than just being protected away from domestic violence, they get support with completing application forms for when they get their access to public funds so that they can apply for universal credit. They get support with accessing other services as well that will be useful to them. They get translation services, and so we like to use them. But as you all know, who work in the sector, trying to get a refuge is very, very difficult. And because people come to us on the day when we try to access refugees, they're not available. But when we do have access to them, we tend to use them. The other one as well I spoke about is housing association. There is provision for people who have got a no recourse to public funds condition to be able to access housing association, but they have to be ones who are not here illegally or as an overstayer. So they would have a right to rent, and they would have a right to work. They would be able to access them. But we tend not to get so many of those. What we tend to get really is people who've already had access to housing association properties, but for whatever reason, when they reapply for their leave to remain to the Home Office grants them in their wisdom leave to remain with no access to public funds. So what we do in cases like that is we would continue to honor the payment of the rent in those cases, because we know it's going to be difficult for certain families to be able to work, especially when they have children who are very young. So we would continue to pay that rent until they change their condition code so that they've got access to public funds. The other thing that I want to speak about as well is the instability that a lot of these families face. Some of the citizens have mentioned it. Some of my colleagues that work in other areas, especially the lady who is a midwife who was had experience in midwifery, has spoken about that. A lot of the referrals that we get sometimes is from midwives, because they come across these families who are, say, living with friends or living with partners who brought them in the UK with a promise that they're going to sort them out in terms of their immigration status. Fortunately, for a lot of the ones who come to us, they already come to us with British children. So again, they've got a route to settlement. So we can support them in terms of getting accommodation and in terms of referring them to immigration advisors to try and sort their immigration status out. But yeah, they obviously go through a lot of instability because they might have to move schools. Like I've said at the beginning, most of the accommodation that we're able to access is in certain part of Manchester, is in North Manchester. So if they've got schools in southern Manchester, it's going to be very difficult for them. A lot of them, a lot of children suffer from their well-being, as the previous speaker spoke about. Sometimes we have children, we've had children who are disabled or have learning difficulties, and they have to be in specific schools. Luckily, some of those schools have got facilities where they can help, for example, with getting a bus pass, so that helps us as well. Imagine if you've immersed yourself as well in a community where, say, you've got access to your community food, to your church, to your mosque and all of that, and you moved away from that, you're going to lose that. And disruption with family life as well. Children may have to move further away from a parent who does not normally live with them. So when parents are separated, it breaks up families. I think you wanted me to speak about how things can be improved as well. And what I've said is more of the good stuff. So if we can get more access to housing association properties, that'll be really good. If we can get more access to refugees, that would be very, very good. It would really help us. But in line with Andy Burnham's homeless prevention strategy, Manchester City Council has decided to do a few things to try and kind of like turn things around for people, for families who are looking for homeless assistance. And that would include the no recourse to people with a no recourse to public funds condition on their status as well. So that is ending the routine use of bed and breakfast accommodation. And I can already see, as somebody who works in the area that I work, I can already see that senior managers are working towards that. And I've attended meetings where I can see they're looking for pathways to try and sort that out, but obviously still in development. So watch the space. Another thing as well is the development and implementation of a medium-term accommodation strategy so that by the time we get to the point where hopefully we've got enough accommodation that families would be able to access in the first instance, rather than to going to hotels, we've got an intermediary, whatever, in place. So unfortunately, that would have to be hotels. Improving the standards of temporary accommodation and support to ensure that better lives and outcome for people who are at risk of finding themselves homeless. And we are going to also enact the recommendation of the CAS/LAC review. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that is to accelerate the delivery of affordable housing in the borough, and in particularly homes at social rent, which are genuinely affordable for local families on the housing waiting list. Unfortunately, that's probably not going to help the cohort of people who we support, unless, of course, if they have got a right to rent and they're able to rent through the housing association scheme. We're also focusing upon the children in our year of the child, and what we're doing is celebrating Manchester's children and young people with a whole city approach to help them shape a future that is safe, happy, healthy, and successful. I'm sure I've gone over my time. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Justina. You went over your time, but what you were saying was almost like, what's the word? A new world is coming, you know, because you can see under a Labour mayor, if he's committed, things can change. And he has the finances as well. I mean, he's running the city, so his commitment is really filtering down. And I didn't even know this, so that's fantastic. I mean, we're going to have to write to Andy to get more information from him, because this is something which needs to be in our general election manifesto, this line of thinking. It's very progressive, and it just takes the burden off a bit, and it makes you realise that if you're committed, things can change for many families who fall into this trap, because that's what it is a trap. So thank you so much, Justina. I really appreciate what you said. And I'm sure there will be some questions for you. So sure. just hold back a bit.
Okay.
Thank you. So our next speaker is William Flack. Hopefully William is there on the line.
Yes, I'm here. Can you see me or hear me?
Yes, can hear you. Could see you. Oh yeah, there you are. Excellent. So the floor's yours now. So please introduce yourself, and you have 7 minutes, but obviously you may go over if you're following Justina.
Okay, thank you. My name's William Flack. I'm a solicitor, and I'm based in Southeast London, and I specialise in housing and homelessness, and I've come to specialise to a degree in applications for people with no recourse to public funds for accommodation through children's services. And before I go on, I should just say that, Justina, your presentation has really restored my faith, but and shown what can be done in a very difficult situation. But I'm afraid that based on my own experience, which doesn't include Manchester, I'm pleased to say, well, I'm sorry to say, I'm afraid I'm going to have to go back to being depressing like the two ladies who we heard from earlier, because I have to say that the behaviour of London authorities towards migrant families has been little short of horrifying for me. This is not just because of the sort of routine and casual cruelty with which applicants have been treated, but it's been the fact that those responsible are social workers and lawyers who I assumed were concerned with the protection of children, but seem to have been able to behave in them. It's a bit like when you see footage on Panorama or something of elderly people in care homes being physically abused. It's that level of horror, which is actually very distressing for, I think, all involved in it. And I think if I did this more than I have done, I would have required some sort of counselling or treatment for it. So against that background, the problem has been that all homelessness provision is restricted because there's only limited resources, but there's a sort of rights-based entitlement to it. So people administering it are always faced with gatekeeping as a way of restricting numbers, finding an excuse to say someone's intentionally homeless or not in priority need. And then the accommodation which is available at the end of that process is by definition going to be of poor quality because there isn't resources there to get better stuff. Now, when it comes to no recourse, that problem is multiplied many times over, not just because those people are not supposed to have recourse to public funds or services, but the message from central government has been a poisonous one, which has been to treat them in a hostile manner. And you can see, for instance, in Lewisham, where I have had a lot of engagement, which I'm pleased to say is in the past because a new mayor in Lewisham and a new team has turned things round. But they adopted a policy about 5 years ago called Robust Front Door, which, as you can imagine, is something that is probably designed to slam in the faces of applicants and only to be opened where there's a threat of legal action. Now, the problem then follows that people were treated in an extremely hostile manner, which led to a very unpleasant assessment process. An example of creating the hostile environment would be to invite what were described as embedded border force or home office staff to sit in on interviews. And this would often consist of a person in what I consider to be a rather unpleasant uniform that they wear, sitting in the meeting for no apparent reason other than to intimidate the applicants, who many of whom had spent a lot of time avoiding detection whilst they were overstaying, and were worried obviously that they could be taken out of the meeting and deported. Other routine problems were children being distressed by the way in which social workers were shouting at their parents. And the ladies who we heard from before mentioned being put under pressure to return to violent partners or abusive situations. I'd heard of a number of cases where it got even worse than that, which was that social workers would contact violent ex-partners and encourage them to have the children, even though they'd been told about the reasons for the relationship breakdown. So that was the spirit in which it was conducted, and the tactic used to refuse to provide support would be to treat the assessment process as a way of finding reasons not to assist. So, for instance, an applicant would be asked to provide their bank statements, and the assumption would be that it could be demonstrated that although they said they had become destitute, they weren't really, and they had access to support and were simply trying it on. Although quite why people would try it on, given the limited resources available for them if they were successful, wasn't said. But the bank statements would be gone through, and any sort of income would be treated as the tip of the iceberg. So if somebody had paid in £50 into their bank account, they'd have to explain this and explain why this person was not giving them similar amounts in cash. Any expenses would be looked at for use, examples of extravagance. So for instance, and this is, I'm not making this up, somebody who was seen to have bought something food-wise in Marks and Spencer's was criticised for living a luxury lifestyle, and also taking their children out for a meal on a birthday or something like that was considered to be decadence. One woman who'd bought her daughter an iPad before she lost her job and became destitute was treated as having untold resources because she'd been able to buy this sort of technology. And also the idea was to make out that the applicant was lying. So it's very easy to, if you're interviewing somebody, to make out that they're lying. You can ask a question in a misleading way. For instance, could you give me your bank statements for the last month? And so they do that. And then at the end of that, you say, oh, but I wanted them for the last year. Why didn't you give me them for the last year? And the answer would be, well, you didn't ask. And it's, oh, yes, I did, but you can't prove that. So I would then write the report saying, eventually, the person gave me their bank statements for the full year. This was routine. So for solicitors like me, faced with assessment reports which found that people were lying or obviously had resources which they weren't disclosing, and therefore their children weren't facing destitution and weren't in need, we would have to spend hours going through these assessment reports and preparing statements, rebutting each and every single allegation, because if we didn't do that and we issued judicial review proceedings, the barristers for the local authority would be highlighting all these examples of dishonesty, and the judge would say, well, you're not denying any of this. So it was an absolute nightmare. Then the attacks, yes, it got even worse, that solicitors helping migrant families would be routinely attacked and accused of dishonesty. I, for instance, was accused in one case where a client had been granted recourse to public funds during a court case, but neither my client nor I knew about it. The council still put in writing that I had known about this, but had deliberately kept the court case going on so I could make more money out of it. I was able to get an apology from the local authority after I made a formal complaint about it. And I've heard of very junior solicitors being seriously intimidated by similar accusations being made against them. So at the end of all that, you'd often only get accommodation for families if you took the council to court, because until then they would just say no, go back to the partner, or do this, do that, anything other than take up offers, receive an offer of assistance. And it was only the legal action that led to the assistance being provided. And so to address the question of why better quality accommodation wasn't provided, I think the answer was that everybody involved was exhausted just by getting something. And we tended to see little hope in persuading the people that were carrying out these dreadful assessments to look at the actual quality of the accommodation sympathetically. When I've been preparing my notes for this talk, I thought, well, I could have been a bit tougher about that. Maybe we should be standing up and running more challenges, and maybe in the future I will. But until now, it's been a major struggle just getting to that point. And one thing that occurs to me, and an example of just the inhumanity of this situation is that the test for receiving assistance under the Children Act is that the children must be facing destitution, because that brings them within the Children Act, despite having no recourse to public funds, because it would be a breach of their human rights not to get support. But the same test is applied for lifting the no recourse condition. So really what local authorities should be doing, and I think this is what sounds like Manchester are doing, is helping people to get access to immigration solicitors or advisors, and also making applications for the lifting of the recourse condition. And a letter from a social worker saying, yes, we've carried out this assessment and found that the children are destitute would be conclusive evidence. But if you suggested this to the local authorities in London, it would be rejected because it would be seen to be somehow helping the applicants, which they weren't entitled to expect because they're outlaws or the sort of people that we have to treat in a hostile way. So I'm pleased to say it does seem to be getting a bit better. It couldn't really have got much worse than it was about 4 years ago. So I've tended to find now with local authorities, and I was dealing with, say, half a dozen local authorities in East and South London, that nowadays I'm tending to find that most of the errors are made by people just not knowing what they're supposed to be doing. I'm not finding the same deliberate abuse of the system by social workers and lawyers, but it may be that other people doing this are doing more of it, and I'm fairly sure it's still going on, but fortunately not in Lewisham and not in the local boroughs that I deal with. And that's it. I'm sorry to be so negative, but all I can say is it does seem to be getting a bit better, and I hope that the case in Manchester with the child being dying as a result of the mould may well highlight. Sorry, it wasn't Manchester, was it? It was sorry, it was north. I'm very London centric, north of London anyway. I'm sorry.
It was Rochdale.
Rochdale. I'm sorry, but that will hopefully highlight, because, for instance, I deal with disrepair cases all the time, and it's been fairly much a sort of standard awareness that mould is damaging to health, but the extent to which it is has not been really taken into account. And this case should highlight just how bad it is, and will lead to more people taking decisive action against, because mould is almost sort of standard problem in London. I mean, it's everywhere. But hopefully that will apply to that, and also identify the problems of putting children in unsuitable accommodation, or highlight it.
Yes.
That's it.
Okay. Thank you so much, William, for the work that you're doing. And yeah, as a London MP, I have to say that the majority of councils which are Labour run in London, they're not really understanding this issue at all. Many think they're very hostile. Heard of some really horrific cases of, women being attacked by, security guards, quote unquote, being removed from council buildings and that. So it's horrible to see, and we can only hope that the young baby that lost his life due to, living in damp will be the catalyst for change, because he can't just have died in vain. We've got to, hopefully people that should be learning from this will learn from it. But we just carry on going. But thanks for everything that you're doing. It does sound like it's a bit difficult where you are, but where you're working. But we really appreciate people like yourself, because as you rightfully say, you get attacked as well when you pick up these cases as a solicitor. So you have to be quite a brave heart to do it, which is good.